Dwarfs are short people, descendants of the Jiayao. They cast off their customs and submitted to proper decorum. Emulating and assimilating, they stood on tippy toes. Subsequently, they dwelt in the central country. In features and looks, there are various sorts. Some are puny and tender, petty and picayune, misshapen and mean. They yell and shout and talk with invective and push people away. Blind and benighted by their relish for wine, they delight in exalting penalty toasts. When drunk, they raise their voices. Abuse and insult come from their mouths. The multitudes are annoyed and resentful. It is difficult to associate with them. Thus, I set forth a Fu. These excerpts are the preface from Cai Yong's Duoren Fu, or Fu on Short People, the longest text on dwarfs in early China. Cai's disdain for dwarfs was not unique, and in most early Chinese texts, dwarfs are depicted in less than positive ways, with writers pigeonholing them into the roles of disabled social charge, sycophantic attendant, and puerile and/or debauched entertainer. This paper is an initial foray into these materials. I will begin by discussing the terminology used in this paper and juru, the word used for dwarfs in early texts. I will then turn to passages in which dwarfs are categorized as disabled and their pejorative and stereotypical portrayals in Warring States and Han texts. Finally, I will address the content of Cai Yong's Fu and its preface, the longest and certainly most disturbing text focused on dwarfs in early China. Throughout this paper, I will use binary terminology introduced by the social model of disability, where impairment relates to a physical phenomenon and disability describes a social construct assigned to that phenomenon. I do this with some hesitation, first recognizing this methodology has its critics, the need for more embodied phenomenological and interactual approaches, and the limitations of this terminology in pre-modern and non-European contexts. Further muddying the waters, proportionate or disproportionate dwarfism may put individuals at a disadvantage in some situations, but be advantageous in others. In early Chinese texts, the most common term for disabled people who are unusually short is juru, ju meaning small or tiny, and ru suggesting their potential role as court as ritual specialist. The nuances and derogatory nature of juru will become clearer in what follows, but by the time it is widely used in Warring States and Han text, it had acquired class-based associations and could be used to make fun of those of shorter stature. For example, in the Zuozhuan, juru is used in a song mocking the defeated aristocrat Zhang Wuzhong, who lived in the 6th century BCE. Quote, "Zhang in robes of fox fur brought us to defeat at Hutai. Our ruler, the little one, sends a juru. That's what he sends. Juru, juru, you have brought about our defeat by Ju." The Zuozhuan, like most early texts, does not offer any clues as to what physically distinguished the body of dwarfs from others, and whether Zhang Wuzhong was a little person is less clear than the derisive and pejorative nature of the use of juru in this song. Olivia Miller notes the case of Zhang is one of the few examples of dwarfism among spring and autumn elites, with another potential candidate as the heir to the state of Chang, whose personal name was Juru. I think in both cases, we will probably never know because in the majority of texts surveyed here, the bulk of which come from the 4th century or later, the 4th century BCE or later, Juru are unnamed and regarded as lower class. To put it another way, both aristocrats may have been little people, but in the class-based distinctions of later texts, they were not Juru. Texts do, however, repeatedly place dwarfs in a category of people with physical impairments, remark on their inability to perform certain tasks, and discuss what occupations were most appropriate for them. For example, in the Wang Zhi, or Royal Regulations chapter in the Book of Rights, dwarfs are included in a list of physically impaired who are in the care of the king. Quote, "The mute, deaf, lame, handicapped, those missing limbs, dwarfs, and workmen were fed according to their abilities," end quote. A poignant example of the assertion that dwarfs could not perform the same activities as others occurs in the biography of the court jester Dongfang Shuo in the Han Shu. In order to receive a larger stipend, the trickster plays a joke on the dwarves working in the imperial stables, telling them that the emperor wants to have them executed due to their uselessness. Addressing the dwarfs, he says, quote, "His Majesty has decided that you fellows are of no benefit to the government. In plowing fields and raising crops, you're surely no match for ordinary men. Given official posts and put in charge of the multitude, you would never be able to bring order to the people. Assigned to the army and dispatched to attack the barbarians, you would be incapable of handling weapons. You contribute nothing to the business of the state. All you do is use up food and clothing, end quote. Other texts suggest, since they could not perform tasks like those noted by Dongfang Shuo, dwarfs were natural entertainers. The most common roles they are also recorded as serving in royal households. In the Lun Heng, or Critical Discourses by Wang Chong, the author remarks, "It is said that in the past, people were employed appropriately. Hunchbacks were gatekeepers and dwarfs were entertainers," end quote. The Huainanzi states more bluntly, quote, "Dwarfs and blind musicians are the troubled invalids of mankind, but the ruler of men uses them to perform music," end quote. This passage is interesting as well because, like the passage from the Royal Regulations chapter of the Book of Rights, it implies the responsibility of the benevolent king to care for the disabled. At the same time, it also suggests the transformation brought about through the beneficence of the ruler of a disabled body from useless social charge to contributing member of the court. Some early texts describe dwarf entertainers specifically as payo juru, or jester-like performers in vaudeville-like entertainments, such as those described in Sima Xiangru's Shangling Fu, or Fu on Shangling Park. Quote, "Then come the payo juru, and singing girls from the land of Didi, to delight the ear and eye and bring mirth to the mind. On all sides, a torrent of gorgeous sound, a pageant of enchanting color." Eastern Han painted earthenware sculptures, referred to as storyteller figurines, or talking and singing figurines in modern scholarship, may also provide visual representation of dwarfs as payo juru. One representative example excavated from a cliff tomb in Shindu, Sichuan, is shirtless with chest and abdomen exposed. The man holds a drum and balances his weight on one leg, while enthusiastically kicking the other forward. Other visual and textual sources suggest that dwarfs were paired with giants in comical skits, which may have fit into the category of payo juru as well. Although few historical records directly address the other roles dwarfs could perform at court, texts repeatedly warn against the ruler's reliance and interest in them, suggesting that, much to the chagrin of early writers, they often gained the ear of the ruler. We get a sense of the possibility of their extended roles at court from a passage in the Han Feizi, where one dwarf appears close to two kings and serves as a spy. The story suggests dwarfs could serve as unofficial go-betweens for rulers. Other texts support the idea that it was common for dwarfs to be part of a ruler's inner circle. Regardless of this potential, dwarfs are not named in early text, with the one exception being Yo Zhan, or Comedian John, a dwarf at the court of the first and second emperors of Qin, although he too notably still lacks a surname. Texts repeatedly pontificate against the predominance of dwarfs at court, tying them with the state's decline and collapse. For example, in the Guanzi, we find the warning, quote, "Even if the prince of men merely listens to talk of seeking pleasure and enjoyment, he will fail. If depraved people occupy the highest positions, they will obstruct those who are worthy, so they will not advance. Such being the case, if it so happens that the country should meet with disaster, entertainers and dwarfs will arise to discuss the affairs of state. In this way, the state will be driven to destruction," end quote. Like royal women and male favorites, their accessibility to the ruler made dwarfs rivals to courtiers, scholars, and other early writers, who tended to write of them in pejorative and stereotypical ways. Han Fei included them in a list of sycophants, one of the 8 treacheries ministers could use to lead the ruler astray. Quote, "The second is called making use of his attendants. What do I mean by this? Dwarf jesters, attendants, and favorites of the ruler, men such as these cry yes, yes, before he has given an order, at once, before he has commanded them. They guess his desire before he knows it himself, watch his face and observe his expression to divine what is in his mind. In unison they step forward, in unison they retire, all of them answering and responding in a single rote, in identical phrases so that they may move the mind of the ruler," end quote. Other writers note the puerile nature of their company. The Guoyu states, quote, "Having dwarfs and hunchbacks by one side is like fraternizing with obstinate children," end quote. Like several passages noted above that describe dwarfs as payo juru, this passage seems to suggest the jester-like slapstick entertainments they performed, while perhaps also hinting at their reduced mental capacity and or maturity of those who associated with them. Similarly, Yangxiong, in the Tai Shuang Jing, or the Canon of Supreme Mystery, also compares an individual who does not steadfastly follow the Confucian way to a dwarf who is stunted intellectually and morally. The immorality of dwarfs, or at the very least the immorality of the entertainments they provided, are critiqued in many texts, such as one in which dwarfs appear alongside seductive and lecherous women. For example, in the Lei Nu Zhuan, or biographies of exemplary women, in the biography of Mei Shi, the wife of Jie, the depraved last ruler of the Xia dynasty, we find, quote, having abandoned propriety and morality, Jie indulged in lustful pastimes with his wives. He constantly sought beautiful women and housed them in the rear palace. He also gathered singers, actors, dwarves, and fools, and those who were able to perform amazing acrobatic feats, all of whom he kept at his side to create decadent entertainments, end quote. Similar decadent entertainments are criticized in the Yueji, or Treatise on Music chapter of the Book of Rites, where dwarf entertainers appear together with the unsuitable mixing of the sexes in Zixia's critique of the new music. Quote, performers advance and bow down, then retreat and bow down, depraved sounds with unending vileness and indulgence. Among entertaining dwarfs, men and women mix, and one cannot tell father from son. Do not talk of such music. It is not in accordance with the way of antiquity, end quote. The most extreme form of disdain for entertaining dwarfs is found in a story about Zixia's master, Confucius, recorded in the Shiji, or records of the historian, with minor variations in the Kungzi Jiayu, or the school sayings of Confucius. While serving Duke Ding of Lu, Confucius goes with him to Jiagu to sign a treaty with Duke Jing of Qi. When a troop of dwarfs and entertainers appear to amuse their party, Confucius flies into a rage, bounds up the stairs, and exclaims, "Those who confuse their lord like this deserve to die," end quote. At his insistence, the dwarfs' heads are cut off and their hands and feet are severed. Exceptions to the general trend of dwarfs as sycophants or lewd and or puerile entertainers occur in texts where they appear as wisecracking and moralizing buji, or humorists. At least one of the jokesters in the biography of the humorist in the Shiji, Yo Zhan, was a dwarf who served at the courts of the first and second emperors of Qin. In his biography, we see him using humor to dissuade the first emperor's desire to enlarge the imperial hunting park, joking that this is a great idea, as the animals will be able to protect the capital from future attacks. Later, when the second emperor wants to lacquer the city walls, he composes a short ditty to dissuade the ruler that provides an example of the witticisms the Guji supplied at court. Quote, lacquered walls will be glassy and hail. When enemies come, they will not be able to scale, end quote. Christian Leys has argued that in most pre-modern societies, the concept of disability was based on a person being, quote, marked or blighted by physical deviance, end quote, rather than the modern conception of disability that considers disabled bodies to have physical or cognitive limitations. In the case of early China, writers seem to stress the moral rather than the physical difference of dwarfs, although lying below the surface is the potential for the conflation of the two. This latency comes to life in Cai Yong's Duanren Fu, or Fu on short people, which melds physical and moral deviance into one by drawing on and or expanding some of the stereotypes noted above. In his preface, Cai begins by portraying dwarfs as semi-civilized barbarians, descended from a race of short people, the Jiayao, who also appear in other texts like the Shanhai Jing, or classics of the mountains and seas. Quote, dwarfs are short people, descendants of the Jiayao, who emerged from the outer regions and were a branch of the Rong and Di. They cast off their customs and submitted to proper decorum. Emulating and assimilating, they stood on tippy toe. Subsequently, they dwelt in the central country. In features and looks, there are various sorts. The ones called dwarfs resemble the father. There was only Yanzi in Qi. He was eloquent and brave. He aided Jing and opposed Cui. To be inflicted with a blade, he did not fear. But others are puny and tender. Petty and picayune, misshapen and mean, they yell and shout and talk with invective and push people away. Blind and benighted by their relish for wine, they delight in exalted penalty toast. When drunk, they raise their voices, abuse and insult comes from their mouths. The multitudes are annoyed and resentful. It is difficult to associate with them. Thus, I set forth a Fu. Drawing comparisons and making parallels, in all cases, I have obtained the shapes and forms. They are truly as I have told them. End quote. In this Fu, the preface to this Fu, Tsai describes dwarfs as having adopted Chinese ways, but as being petty, rowdy, and prone to fighting and debauchery, reminiscent of the lewd entertainment and puerile behavior suggested by the text above. Tsai produces one exception and counterpoint to this characterization, that of the statesman Yan Ying. However, as Mark Lauren Osselin in his study of this Fu notes, although Yan Ying is described as being short of stature, he is never called a juru in other texts. So it's interesting as to why Tsai Yong included him here. The main text of this short Fu then shifts to comparisons of the physical appearance of dwarfs to those of animals and other objects diminutive in size. Quote, Jing cocks, fledgling grebes, pigeon chicks, quail hens, crested hoopoes, and woodpeckers. Observe the short people. Their appearance are like these. Ba peak horses, xia ponies, locusts in hibernation underground, crickets in reeds, chrysalides in cocoons, silkworms wriggling hairs. Regard the short people. Their appearance are like these. Wooden door middle post, beam top supports, damaged chisel heads, broken handled axes, pita hand drums, mallets for repairing shoes, slipped off hammer handles, pestles for pounding garden shallots. Regard the short people. Their appearances are like so. End quote. Unlike most early texts that do not focus on the physical impairment and difference of the dwarf's body, here Tsai uses it as a basis for complicated wordplay and comedic effect. He first compares dwarfs to small birds, horses, insects, and finally, small architectural supports and tools. Although his humor is offensive to our ears, we can only assume that it would have been acceptable to his contemporaries. Combined with its preface, Tsai Yong's Fu intertwines the moral and physical difference of dwarfs, a conflation which is also latent in other texts. This seems partly connected to the dwarfs' presence at court, which, like that of male and female attendants, was based on their physical difference, rather than merit or reputable talent. This acts as an influence threaten the political vision and worldview of some writers, who turn them into a set of tropes, useless social charge, sycophantic attendant, and or immoral entertainer. At this point, greater understanding of the perception of other disabilities in early China is needed to fully understand how this was or was not intertwined with conceptions of their physical impairment. Their associations with court favorites and frivolous entertainment is clear in the above texts, but what is their connection to other disabled groups, such as those listed in the passage from the Book of Rights? A further exploration of questions like these will allow for a more nuanced understanding of the construction of the social category of dwarf in early China. Thank you.